Hello everyone. Ever walked past an old, imposing building in a city like Washington D.C. and wondered what secrets are sealed away inside? Well, sometimes those secrets are found and the reality can be far stranger and far more significant than fiction. What's the oldest building you know with a hidden room or strange story attached? I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. This particular story starts not with a dramatic raid, but with renovation dust and the mundane frustrations of historic preservation. The Grand Madison Hotel, a Washington landmark since the late 1800s, a place where presidents had dined and deals had been struck in smoke-filled rooms, was finally getting a much-needed overhaul. Years of deferred maintenance had taken their toll, and the new ownership was determined to restore it to its former glory, blending Gilded Age charm with modern luxury. Architects pored over original blueprints, dusty and fragile, cross-referencing them with modern building plans and structural surveys. Most things matched, allowing the careful dance of demolition and construction to begin. But then came the fourth floor. The blueprints for this wing showed a series of standard hotel rooms, service closets, and utility shafts. Yet, a section of one corridor felt off. Soundings and later, more sophisticated scans revealed a void where a room should have been, a significant space that simply didn't exist on any current floor plan and was inconsistent with the original blueprints for the layout as it was known and documented throughout the hotel's operating history. It was located between two large suites, a space that, logically, should have been part of one of them, or perhaps a smaller, connecting room. Instead, the wall running along the corridor here was solid, unbroken, with no door, no windows, which wouldn't be unusual on an internal corridor wall, but also, crucially, no indication from the exterior architecture that a room was missing from this section of the floor plan. It was as if a section of the building's interior simply vanished from the records and from visible reality on the corridor side. Initial thoughts among the construction crew and project managers ranged from a drafting error on the old plans to a long-forgotten storage space walled off decades ago. Old buildings in major cities like D.C. are full of such anomalies. But this space was large, seemingly spanning the width of a typical room. Curiosity turned into a minor logistical problem. What was behind that wall? Could it contain hazardous materials? Was it structurally significant? They consulted the Historical Society again, hoping for some forgotten annotation on alternative layouts or later modifications. Nothing. The mystery persisted. The wall itself looked like the others along the corridor, plaster over lath, painted multiple times over the decades. Tapping on it produced a solid sound. No obvious hollow spots that might indicate a hidden door or panel. It seemed just a wall. Yet the scans didn't lie. There was a cavity, a substantial one directly behind it. The decision was made, cautiously, to investigate further. A small section of the wall, about eye level, was carefully cut out. Behind the plaster and a lath wasn't the expected brick or concrete of an exterior wall or the framing of another room. It was darkness. Deep, still, silent darkness, thick with the scent of undisturbed dust and aged materials. A powerful flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing another wall, set back several feet. This second wall was older, constructed of thick, dark wood planks, reinforced with heavy iron straps. And in this wooden wall, there was a door. No handle, no visible hinges from this side, simply a solid, unyielding barrier that looked like it hadn't been opened in maybe a century. It was sealed, not just by time, but deliberately. There were no seams visible around the edges, no keyhole, just the dark wood and iron straps. The air that wafted out once the opening in the plaster wall was large enough was cool, stale, and carried that specific musty odor of long enclosed spaces. Old wood, decaying fabric, trapped air that hadn't exchanged with the outside world for generations. It felt less like a forgotten storage space and more like a deliberate concealment. The construction foreman, a veteran of many tricky historical renovations, felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just an architectural quirk. This felt intentional. The sheer effort taken to conceal the outer wall, then build such a robust, unopenable, from this side at least, inner door, spoke volumes. The presence of this hidden room, unrecorded, deliberately sealed off, in a hotel with a long and storied history in the heart of the nation's capital, raised questions that building codes and historical records couldn't answer. What was in there? And why was it hidden so thoroughly? At this point, the hotel management, advised by the renovation team and their legal counsel, realized this wasn't just a construction issue anymore. Given the location, the age, and the sheer strangeness of a sealed, unrecorded room, local police were called. The police arrived, took one look at the carefully cut hole, the deep dark space beyond, and the ancient sealed door within, and quickly escalated. A detective with experience in historical cases or potential crime scenes was brought in. He too felt the weight of the silence emanating from the opening. This wasn't a simple break-in or a recently abandoned space. This was history, deliberately buried. Given the historical context of the Grand Madison, its past clientele and its location mere blocks from federal buildings, the decision was made to contact federal authorities, specifically the FBI. Within hours, the quiet hum of construction was replaced by a different kind of activity. Unmarked sedans arrived. Agents in dark jackets and sterile gear began to appear, and the area around the fourth floor anomaly was secured, tape going up, curious workers being politely but firmly moved away. The air grew tense. What had started as a structural mystery was rapidly transforming into a potential federal case. The FBI agents examined the opening, shining powerful lights into the void. They noted the construction of the outer wall, the gap, and then the inner wooden door. Their initial assessment aligned with the foreman's gut feeling. This was no accident. This space had been intentionally created and sealed, likely a very long time ago. The question now wasn't just what was inside, but who had put it there, and why. A specialist team, including forensic engineers and historical experts from within the Bureau's ranks, was assembled and briefed. The directive was clear: assess the space, determine the safest way to enter without disturbing potential evidence, and document everything meticulously. The history of the Grand Madison, they knew, intersected with powerful people and pivotal moments in American history. A deliberately hidden room here could contain anything from forgotten personal effects to something far more consequential. As the specialized team prepared their equipment, endoscopic cameras, sensitive listening devices, tools for a non-destructive entry, a palpable sense of anticipation settled over the secured corridor. They were about to step into a forgotten slice of the past, a space potentially frozen in time, holding secrets that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. The air, thick with dust and history, seemed to hold its breath. The decision was made to use minimal impact entry methods initially. A bore scope was inserted through a tiny hole drilled near the edge of the wooden door, allowing agents to get a visual without full breach. The view inside was restricted, murky, illuminated only by the scope's tiny light source, but it confirmed the room's existence and provided a first glimpse of its contents. It was a small, Rectangular room, maybe 10 by 12 feet. The air inside was still, heavy with the smell of extreme age. Dust lay thick over everything, a soft grey blanket that muffled shapes and details. In the center of the room stood a heavy, dark wooden desk, the kind with deep drawers and thick legs, perhaps oak or mahogany, though it was hard to tell under the dust. A single chair was pushed neatly under it. There was a tall, narrow cabinet or wardrobe against one wall, its door slightly ajar. Against another wall, what looked like several heavy trunks or chests were stacked. The most striking feature, however, was the sheer lack of clutter. The room wasn't filled with junk. It seemed intentionally furnished, almost like a small private office or study that had simply been abandoned mid-use and sealed off. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle within the room itself, or damage that suggested it was sealed due to structural collapse. It looked preserved, eerily so. The forensic team confirmed no immediate atmospheric hazards, though masks were still required due to the dust and potential for mold spores. The entry plan was refined, a careful sectioning of the wooden door. Using specialized saws designed for minimal vibration and dust dispersal, a rectangular panel was cut from the door, large enough for an agent to step through. The process was slow, deliberate. The sound of the saw a stark intrusion into the long-held silence. Each cut was monitored, the surrounding structure checked for stability. Finally, the section came free, eased outwards, and carefully lowered onto a protected surface. The opening revealed the room fully to the powerful beams of the FBI agents' flashlights. The dust motes danced in the light, creating a surreal, almost ethereal scene. The furniture was indeed as seen through the scope: the desk, the chair, the cabinet, the chests. Everything was covered in an astonishingly thick layer of dust, undisturbed for decades. On the surface of the desk, clearly visible even under the dust, was an open ledger or book, and beside it a scattering of papers, as if someone had been interrupted mid-task. An ashtray on the desk held the remains of cigarettes, long turned to ash, suggesting someone had spent time here. On a small side table near the chair, a half-empty glass stood, its contents evaporated long ago, leaving a residue on the bottom. It was a tableau, frozen in time. The FBI entry team, clad in white forensic suits, entered slowly, their movements precise and cautious. Every step was measured, every observation noted and photographed. The air was heavy with the weight of the past. The immediate objective was to secure the scene, document the layout and condition exactly as found, and identify anything that could be immediately perishable or hazardous. They worked methodically, like archaeologists excavating a delicate site. Laser scans captured the room's dimensions and the precise location of every object. High-resolution photography documented the scene from multiple angles before anything was touched. The dust itself was treated as a potential layer of evidence, its composition and stratification potentially offering clues about the time the room was sealed. Near the door, on the floor just inside, a small, dark object was spotted, partially obscured by dust. Careful brushing revealed it to be a key ring with a single old-fashioned key attached. Its significance was immediately apparent. Was this the key to the inner door, perhaps dropped as the last person left and sealed it from the outside? Or a key to something within the room? It was bagged and tagged with extreme care. The cabinet against the wall was the next focus after the general layout was documented. It was a tall, heavy wooden piece. The door, slightly ajar, revealed shelves within. These weren't filled with clothes or personal effects. Instead, they held stacks of boxes and bundles, tied with ribbon or string that had long since faded and become brittle. The boxes looked like archival boxes, made of heavy cardboard or wood, though caked in dust. The bundles appeared to be papers, tightly bound. This was the first strong indication that the room wasn't just an abandoned office, but potentially a repository. The team resisted the urge to immediately open everything. The state of preservation, while remarkable in some ways, also meant the contents were extremely fragile. Paper and textiles exposed to stagnant air for decades could disintegrate upon rough handling. A call was made to bring in specialized archival and conservation experts alongside the standard forensic team. The chests stacked against the wall were also examined visually. They appeared to be heavy, wooden travel trunks, the kind used in the early 20th century, reinforced with metal. They looked locked, but there were no visible keyholes in some, suggesting complex locking mechanisms, or they were simply latched shut and sealed. Their weight suggested they were full. What could be in them? Clothing? Personal items? Or more of the mysterious contents hinted at by the boxes in the cabinet? The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation and caution. Every artifact, no matter how seemingly insignificant, the glass on the table, the ledger on the desk, the contents of the ashtray, the dust itself, was potential evidence, a clue in a puzzle that was only just beginning to form. The team worked for hours in silence, broken only by the quiet clicks of cameras and the hushed instructions of the lead agent. As the initial documentation phase neared completion, the focus shifted slightly. They had seen the surface, the state of preservation. Now, they needed to understand the nature of the contents, starting with the items most readily visible and accessible, like the papers on the desk. Carefully, using tweezers and brushes, the papers on the desk were separated and examined. They were extremely fragile, the edges brittle, the paper yellowed and thin. The ink, however, seemed relatively well preserved. The language was English, handwritten in a script that was neat, but clearly from an earlier era, perhaps the 1930s or 40s, based on the penmanship style and the quality of the paper. Some sheets appeared to be personal notes. Others looked like excerpts from ledgers or records, containing columns of numbers and names. Initial impressions suggested financial transactions, perhaps related to business dealings or accounts. Alongside these were sheets that looked different, more formal, typed documents, some with official-looking letterheads that were hard to read under the dust. There were also pages filled with what looked like random sequences of letters and numbers, immediately raising suspicions of coded messages. The realization quickly dawned on the agents handling the papers. This wasn't just personal correspondence or forgotten business records. The mixture of financial notes, potentially official documents, and what appeared to be cryptography pointed towards something more complex, something potentially illicit or covert. The items on the desk were meticulously photographed in place before being carefully lifted, placed into individual acid-free sleeves, and assigned unique evidence numbers. The open ledger was even more intriguing. Its pages were filled with neat, double-entry bookkeeping entries. Dates were visible, spanning several years in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The entries weren't simple business transactions. They involved large sums of money, referenced specific foreign currencies, and listed names that, even in a preliminary glance, weren't immediately recognizable as prominent figures of the era from standard public records. There were also references to packages, deliveries, and consultations, terms that seemed deliberately vague and potentially euphemistic. Alongside the financial details were cryptic notes, sometimes scribbled in margins, sometimes integrated into the entries themselves. These notes often included locations, European cities, South American ports, even specific addresses within Washington, D.C. and New York. The complexity of the ledger, its age, and the nature of the entries immediately flagged it as high-priority evidence. It wasn't just a record of money changing hands, it appeared to be a detailed account of clandestine activities. The ashtray, examined under a microscope, revealed not just cigarette ash, but also a few partially burned fragments of paper, too small and charred to be immediately legible. These were carefully collected as well, as they might contain remnants of information that someone attempted to destroy. The key found near the door was tested on the desk drawers and the cabinet. It didn't fit the cabinet latch, which appeared to be a simple, if old, mechanism. It also didn't fit the main lock on the desk drawers. However, after some searching, a smaller, hidden keyhole was discovered on one of the desk drawers, cleverly disguised as part of the decorative molding. The key slid in smoothly. The drawer opened with a groan of old wood. Inside, beneath a false bottom, was a shallow compartment containing a few more items. A small, leather-bound notebook, a handful of loose jewels, small, uncut stones that didn't appear to be immediately valuable but suggested a tangible asset, and a single, tarnished silver locket containing a faded photograph of a woman. The notebook was filled with more handwritten notes, but these were even more cryptic than the ledger, written partly in English, partly in what looked like a simple numerical substitution cipher, and occasionally short phrases in a foreign language that an accompanying linguist from the FBI team tentatively identified as German or Russian, though the script was difficult to be certain of in the initial assessment. This notebook seemed more personal, perhaps a journal or a log of specific encounters or observations, contrasting with the ledger's focus on finance. The discovery of the false bottom and its contents solidified the impression that this room was used for secret purposes. The person who used this room was meticulous, careful, and dealing with matters they wished to keep absolutely hidden. The chests remained unopened for now, requiring specialized tools and potentially risking damage to their contents due to their age and weight. The priority was to secure and transport the paper documents and smaller items, which were deemed most fragile and potentially most informative in the short term. A secure transport protocol was established, involving climate-controlled containers and a continuous chain of custody from the hotel room to a specialized FBI forensic lab and archival facility. The sheer volume of paper documents in the cabinet also needed assessment. Carefully pulling one of the bundles out, agents found it was tied with brittle silk ribbon and contained dozens of sheets of thin paper, folded and secured. These too looked like a mix of typed reports, handwritten notes, and sheets filled with coded messages. The scale of the find was becoming apparent. This wasn't just a handful of hidden items. It was a substantial archive, deliberately concealed. As the day wore on, the secured corridor buzzed with quiet activity. Agents, forensic specialists, conservators working together, meticulously documenting and packaging the past. The initial shock of discovery had given way to the systematic process of evidence recovery. The question of who was responsible for this hidden archive and what its contents truly meant loomed large, pushing the investigation far beyond a simple discovery of forgotten property. The carefully packaged contents of the sealed room, the ledger, the notebooks, the bundles of papers, the items from the desk, and the false drawer, even samples of the dust and air, were transported under heavy guard to a specialized FBI facility equipped for handling sensitive and aged materials. Here, a multidisciplinary team was assembled. Forensic document examiners, crypt analysts, historians specializing in the period, primarily 1930s and 40s, linguists and intelligence analysts. The scale of the find required a dedicated operational task force. The first phase at the lab involved stabilization and preliminary cataloging. The documents were incredibly fragile. Archival experts worked in climate-controlled rooms, using brushes, vacuums, and specialized tools to carefully remove the layers of dust without damaging the brittle paper. Each sheet, bundle, and item was photographed in ultra-high resolution, both in visible light and using multispectral imaging to reveal details potentially invisible to the naked eye, such as faded ink or watermarks. The process was painstaking, taking days just to process the initial items from the desk and a few bundles from the cabinet. As the dust was cleared and the documents became legible, the content began to reveal itself more clearly. The ledger was indeed a detailed financial record, but it wasn't just about money. Many entries correlated monetary transfers with events or communications. For example, an entry showing a large withdrawal in a foreign currency might be adjacent to a note referencing a meeting in Zurich or the arrival of package K. The names listed weren't random. Cross-referencing with old manifests, passenger lists, and limited historical intelligence databases began to yield potential identities. Many appeared to be businessmen, diplomats, or individuals with known or suspected connections to foreign entities during the turbulent pre-war and early war years. The coded messages were a major focus for the cryptanalysts. Initial assessments suggested several different ciphers might be in use, ranging from simple substitution or transposition ciphers, like the numerical one in the small notebook, to potentially more complex systems. Cracking these required significant computational power and expertise in historical cryptography. The language fragments in the notebook proved to be a mix of German and Russian, confirming the linguist's initial suspicions and immediately pointing towards potential links to European powers during that era. The typed documents, once cleaned, revealed more. Some were seemingly innocuous reports, perhaps business correspondence or summaries of meetings. But others used careful, almost coded language, discussing sensitive matters under the guise of commercial or diplomatic activity. The letterheads, when identifiable, sometimes pointed to legitimate organizations, import-export companies, lobbying firms, or even seemingly harmless cultural societies. But the content suggested their true purpose might have been otherwise. There was one particularly intriguing series of typed memos that referenced Project Nightingale, discussing funding, logistics, and communication protocols. The term Project Nightingale was not familiar to the intelligence analysts, suggesting it was either a highly compartmentalized operation or a code name not recorded in standard archives. The loose papers from the desk also included several partial or complete lists of names and addresses, some in the US, some abroad. These lists didn't appear to be simple contact lists. They lacked phone numbers or email addresses, obviously, and instead often included cryptic annotations next to the names. Single letters, symbols, or short phrases like reliable, source X, or handler. This looked like a network. A network of individuals connected by the activities detailed in the ledger and the coded messages. The historical experts on the team began digging into the backgrounds of the individuals whose names were appearing repeatedly. Many had moved in circles that intersected with government, finance, and international relations. Some had been briefly investigated during periods of heightened counter-espionage activity, but nothing substantial was ever proven. It seemed this hidden archive might contain the proof that had eluded investigators decades ago. The state of the silver locket with the woman's picture prompted a separate investigation. Was this person connected to the owner of the room, or was she part of the network? Attempts were made to identify her from the faded photograph, using facial recognition software against historical photo databases, though the quality and angle made this challenging. The uncut jewels were assessed. They weren't high-value diamonds or rubies, but rather industrial-grade stones, or possibly early synthetic gems, which had specific uses in certain industries, including precision manufacturing relevant to military technology of the era. This added another layer to the mystery. Were these payments, or were they related to technological acquisition or transfer? The chests remained unopened, awaiting specialized conservation techniques. Their contents were anticipated to be heavy, and opening them required careful planning to avoid damaging potential artifacts inside. As the first few bundles of papers were processed and initial decrypts of some simpler codes were achieved, a clearer, though still incomplete, picture began to form. This was not just a forgotten office. It was a secure archive belonging to someone deeply involved in activities that required secrecy, coded communication, foreign contacts, and significant financial resources during a critical period of global history. The nature of Project Nightingale and the identities of the people in the network were the immediate, pressing questions driving the investigation. The implications of such an archive existing, undiscovered for so long in a prominent Washington hotel, were profound, potentially rewriting aspects of historical understanding regarding espionage and political maneuvering in the mid-20th century. As the decryption efforts progressed, the true nature of the coded messages began to emerge. The most complex cipher used appeared to be a variant of a one-time pad, or something very close to it, suggesting a high level of security awareness on the part of the message senders. However, inconsistencies or errors in its application, or perhaps fragments of messages enciphered with slightly less robust methods, allowed the FBI's cryptanalysts to gain toeholds. Slowly, painfully, sequences of seemingly random letters and numbers began to yield coherent text. The language was primarily English, but the syntax and phrasing were often stiff or translated, suggesting it might have originated from non-native speakers or been relayed through intermediaries. The content of these decrypted messages was explosive. They detailed sensitive political information being transmitted, economic data being secretly gathered, and instructions being passed for various actions. The dates on the messages aligned perfectly with the dates in the financial ledger, creating a clear correlation between payments, communications, and potentially actions taken. Project Nightingale, mentioned in the typed memos, began to take on a clearer definition through the coded traffic and ledger entries. It appeared to be an operation focused on influencing political and economic decisions within the United States during the late 1930s and early 1940s, precisely the period when global powers were maneuvering intensely and the US was debating its role in the burgeoning world conflict. The project involved gathering intelligence on US government policy debates, economic vulnerabilities and public opinion shifts, and potentially attempting to steer them through various means: lobbying, disseminating propaganda, disguised as news or analysis, or influencing key individuals. The names appearing in the decrypted messages and cross-referenced with the lists and ledger entries started to paint a disturbing picture. They included individuals who were prominent figures in business, media, and even some lower-level government functionaries of the time. None were household names from the highest echelons of power, but they were people in positions to observe, gather information, or subtly influence opinion or policy in specific, non-obvious ways. This wasn't a network of James Bonds. It was a network of influencers and informants, meticulously cultivated and compensated. The foreign language fragments in the notebook, confirmed as a mix of German and Russian, correlated with the destinations mentioned in the ledger and some decrypted messages. It seemed the operation had ties to multiple foreign entities, though the primary beneficiary or controller was not immediately clear, or perhaps it served multiple masters simultaneously or sequentially. The German fragments often related to economic intelligence and political sentiment towards Europe, while the Russian ones seemed more focused on technological data and labor movements. This duality added another layer of complexity. Was the operative running this room serving one nation with multiple interests, or juggling loyalties between competing powers? The meticulous detail in the ledger suggested a highly organized individual, someone who needed to keep precise records of their activities, income and expenses, perhaps for reporting back to their handlers or simply for their own accounting. The presence of the industrial-grade jewels in the false bottom of the drawer now made more sense. They might have been a form of payment, untraceable cash equivalents, or perhaps even related to technological components themselves, if they were synthetic stones used in precision instruments. The faded photograph in the locket remained a mystery. Was she a handler, a fellow operative, a loved one? Without identification, she was a ghost in the archive, a human face in a collection dominated by cold data and coded communications. The sheer volume of documents also spoke volumes. This wasn't a temporary drop point. It was a sustained archive built up over several years. The ceiling of the room suggested a sudden, necessary abandonment, perhaps due to imminent discovery. A change in circumstances, like the start of US involvement in WIP2 dramatically altering the operational environment, or the death or disappearance of the operative. The fact that the key was found inside the room near the door, along with the state of the desk as if mid-task, hinted at a swift departure, likely with the intention of returning, an intention that was never fulfilled. The investigation broadened dramatically. While the archival team continued the slow process of cleaning, preserving, and scanning the remaining documents in the chests, which were indeed filled with more bundles of papers, maps, and small objects, the intelligence analysts and historians worked to piece together the network and its objectives based on the initial findings. They began cross-referencing the names and activities mentioned in the documents with historical events of the period. Were there specific policy decisions, media campaigns, or economic shifts during 1938 to 1942 that could potentially have been influenced by this network? Could this archive shed new light on historical controversies or explain previously inexplicable events? The implications of a sophisticated foreign-linked influence network operating within Washington, D.C. on the eve of World War II were significant, raising questions about the vulnerability of the U.S. political system at a critical juncture in history. The contents of this dusty, forgotten room were proving to be far more than just historical curiosities. They were potentially rewriting a hidden chapter of American history. As the chests were carefully opened and their contents revealed, more bundles of documents, maps with handwritten annotations, small objects like radio components and miniature cameras, antique but clearly designed for clandestine use, and even a few rolls of undeveloped film. The full scope of the operation documented in the hidden room began to crystallize. The maps, for instance, weren't just standard geographical maps. Many were detailed city maps of Washington, D.C. and New York, marked with circles, crosses, and handwritten notes indicating locations of government buildings, foreign embassies, businesses, and what appeared to be safe points or rendezvous locations. Some maps had routes drawn on them, annotated with timings or descriptions of surveillance points. These weren't maps for a tourist. They were operational tools. The photographic equipment, though primitive by modern standards, was state-of-the-art for covert photography in the late 1930s. The undeveloped film was sent to a specialized lab capable of handling ancient film stock. Developing it was a delicate, high-risk process, with no guarantee of salvaging any images. The documents within the chests mirrored and expanded upon those found earlier. There were more ledgers, continuing the financial records over a longer period than initially thought, stretching back to the mid-1930s. There were hundreds more coded messages, requiring continued, intensive decryption efforts. And there were reports, detailed, typewritten reports, some marked with symbols or code words, summarizing intelligence gathered. These reports covered a wide range of topics: internal debates within the US, State Department regarding foreign policy, economic forecasts and industrial production capacities, assessments of military readiness, and even observations on the personal habits and political leanings of specific individuals in positions of power or influence. The level of detail and the consistency across multiple reports suggested a well-placed, well-informed network of sources feeding information to the operative using the room. The sophistication of the operation as revealed by the compiled documents was remarkable for its time. It wasn't just passive intelligence gathering. The documents also contained notes and instructions related to disinformation campaigns, attempts to plant specific stories in the press, and strategies for lobbying congressional representatives on certain issues. Project Nightingale wasn't just about observing. It was about actively attempting to manipulate events. The linguistic analysis of the decoded messages and some handwritten notes by the operative began to suggest their background. The mix of fluent English with subtle, non-native grammatical structures and vocabulary choices, combined with the use of multiple foreign languages, primarily German and Russian, but with occasional references or notes that hinted at other languages, perhaps as source material or points of contact, suggested someone highly educated, likely European, with extensive international experience. They were clearly proficient in finance, political analysis, and the logistics of running a clandestine network. The identity of the operative, however, remained elusive. There was no direct identification in the documents, no diary explicitly stating, "My name is X," no passport, no identifying papers that weren't either coded or seemingly throwaways. The personal items were minimal: the locket, the keyring, the residual evidence in the ashtray and glass. It was as if the individual had meticulously scrubbed away any personal trace while maintaining a detailed archive of their work. This suggested a high degree of training and operational discipline. The historical context became increasingly important. The period covered by the archive directly preceded and included the crucial years of U.S. neutrality debates and the nation's entry into World War II. Information regarding U.S. intentions, capabilities, and internal divisions would have been incredibly valuable to foreign powers at this time. The specific focus on economic and industrial capacity, alongside political sentiment, pointed towards interests keen on understanding or potentially disrupting the US's ability to function as a global power and an arsenal of democracy. The correlation between the names appearing in the network lists and known historical figures was a sensitive issue. Some individuals were long deceased, their legacies seemingly secure. Others had descendants who were still prominent. The potential for this archive to rewrite biographies and expose long-buried connections was significant and carried considerable political sensitivity. The FBI team worked under strict secrecy, aware that premature leaks could cause international incidents, personal ruin for families, and potentially compromise ongoing historical research or even active intelligence operations if any descendants or associated entities were still active. The small, unassuming room in the old hotel had yielded an archive that wasn't just a historical record. It was a potentially live wire connecting the past to the present through complex webs of influence and long-held secrets. The investigation was no longer just about identifying the operative or the network. It was about understanding the full impact of their actions and managing the profound historical and political implications of their discovery. The detailed maps, the spy gear, the extensive records of intelligence gathering and influence operations painted a vivid picture of a sophisticated, long-term effort operating in the heart of the US capital, hidden in plain sight within the walls of a grand hotel. As the analysis of the voluminous records from the sealed room deepened, the structure and methods of Project Nightingale became clearer. It operated through multiple layers. At the core was likely the operative who used the room, a central node managing communications, finances, and the dissemination of intelligence. This individual coordinated a network of sources and assets, who themselves were often unaware of the broader operation or who they were ultimately serving. These sources ranged from individuals with access to government or business information to those who could facilitate logistical support or help with spreading specific narratives. The coded messages weren't always from obvious sources. Some appeared to be disguised as normal business telegrams or correspondence, using hidden channels or codes embedded within seemingly innocent text. This required not just cryptanalysis, but also expertise in historical communication methods and the subtle art of concealment. The developed film from the miniature cameras, against the odds, yielded some salvageable images, though many were degraded. Those that were clear enough to analyze proved invaluable. They were primarily photographs of documents, close-ups of papers on desks, likely in offices or meeting rooms, charts, and diagrams. Some appeared to be internal government memos or reports, confirming that the network had access to sensitive, non-public information. Other photos were of individuals, often taken discreetly from a distance, potential targets for recruitment, individuals under surveillance, or perhaps meetings taking place. These faces, once enhanced and run through modern facial recognition against historical photo databases, began to match some of the names on the network lists, providing visual confirmation of their involvement or contact with the operative. The maps, when cross-referenced with the coded messages and reports, revealed operational details. Dead drop locations, marked by symbols or subtle annotations, routes used for surveillance or travel, and safe houses. Some locations were in public places, others in seemingly private residences or offices. The use of a prestigious hotel like the Grand Madison itself as a base of operations, with a hidden room, suggested a need for both proximity to centers of power and a secure, inconspicuous location for handling sensitive materials. The identity of the operative remained the most challenging puzzle. The meticulous lack of personal identifiers was a professional trait. However, subtle clues emerged. The type of cigarette ash in the ashtray, the specific brand of paper used in some handwritten notes, once identified by paper analysis experts, the particular wear patterns on the furniture. These were all data points collected and analyzed. The style of the handwritten notes, while neat, had certain idiosyncratic formations that might be matched to other historical documents. Linguists noted recurring grammatical structures or vocabulary choices that could potentially point to a specific region or linguistic background. The historical context grew more critical. By comparing the intelligence gathered in the archive with known historical events and intelligence reports from the US and its allies, post-war declassified records, analysts could gauge the accuracy and value of the information the network was collecting and transmitting. Did it influence specific outcomes? Did it provide foreign powers with crucial insights? The documents suggested a successful operation that provided actionable intelligence on US economic capabilities, political divisions, and public sentiment during a time when the US's stance was pivotal to the global balance of power. The ultimate beneficiaries of this intelligence and influence operation seemed to be primarily Germany and, to a lesser extent, potentially the Soviet Union, based on the focus areas and language fragments. This raised complex questions about pre-war alliances and covert cooperation between seemingly opposing powers on certain objectives. The scale of the deception was significant. The individuals in the network were likely operating under various levels of knowledge and motivation. Some might have been ideologically aligned, others financially compensated, some perhaps even blackmailed or coerced. The archive contained some notes that hinted at the methods used to manage these assets, including references to payments and handling instructions. The emotional toll of dealing with this discovery began to weigh on the team. Uncovering evidence of betrayal and covert manipulation by individuals long seen as respectable or even patriotic figures was sobering. The fact that this operation had remained hidden for so many decades underscored the effectiveness of its concealment and the depth of the secrets involved. The sealed room wasn't just a time capsule. It was a Pandora's box, containing revelations that could ripple through historical understanding and affect the legacies of individuals and institutions. The FBI's primary focus remained on securing the information, completing the analysis, and understanding the full historical truth contained within the dusty confines of that small, forgotten space. The question of public disclosure, given the sensitivity of the contents, was a complex one, involving balancing historical transparency with national security concerns and the privacy, or reputations, of individuals and families who had no knowledge of these long-buried activities. The process of identifying the operative, the central figure who maintained the hidden room and directed Project Nightingale, became a painstaking exercise in forensic history and pattern analysis. With no direct personal identification found in the room, the team had to build a profile based on the minutiae of the archive itself. The handwriting style in the notebooks and ledger was analyzed by experts, cross-referenced against databases of historical handwriting samples, including those of known foreign agents and individuals who might have had access to the hotel or the circles mentioned in the documents. The specific type of cigarette smoked, identified from residual nicotine compounds in the ashtray and ash analysis, was researched. Was it a popular American brand, or a foreign one that might indicate the operative's origin or recent travel? The peculiar wear pattern on the chair suggested someone who spent long hours hunched over the desk, possibly writing or working with documents. Analysis of residual fibers in the room and on the furniture hinted at the type of clothing worn, though this was less conclusive due to contamination over decades. The single key found near the door underwent metallurgical analysis. Its composition and manufacturing style could potentially point to its origin or the lock maker. While it didn't fit the visible locks, the possibility remained that it belonged to a lock on one of the chests that was breached non-destructively, or perhaps an external lock related to the room's original unsealed state, although the latter seemed less likely given its location inside the sealed space. The locket and the faded photograph of the woman remained a key potential link to the operative's personal life or network. Facial recognition had yielded no definitive match from public or even restricted historical databases. Investigators began researching known associates of individuals named in the archive, looking for any connection to a woman matching the rough age and appearance in the photo. Was she a spouse, a handler, a fellow operative, or a victim? The lack of context made her identity a persistent enigma. Simultaneously, the focus expanded beyond the room itself. Historical records of the Grand Madison Hotel during the 1930s and early 1940s were meticulously examined. Who were the long-term residents? Were there any individuals who fit the profile of a sophisticated, internationally connected person with potential ties to the countries of interest? Were there staff members who might have been compromised or complicit? Old hotel registers, employment records, and even anecdotal histories were scrutinized. This proved challenging, as many records from that era were incomplete or lost. However, researching the hotel's clientele during specific periods mentioned in the ledger and coded messages, especially around the dates of significant transactions or communications, yielded some potential leads. Were any of the individuals named in the archive guests at the hotel concurrently? Were there unusual patterns of room bookings or staff interactions? The historical and intelligence analysts continued piecing together the narrative of Project Nightingale itself. The intelligence gathered and transmitted covered a wide range of sensitive topics, suggesting a sophisticated, multifaceted collection effort. There were detailed reports on U.S. industrial production capabilities, steel, aircraft, shipping, internal political debates, isolationism versus interventionism, public opinion polls, sometimes showing remarkably granular data, suggesting a professional polling or information-gathering effort, and assessments of key US figures. The analysis of the coded messages revealed not just the content of the communications, but also the operational tempo. Periods of intense activity followed by lulls, potentially correlating with global events or the presence, absence of the operative. The messages also sometimes contained metadata, such as transmission times or references to specific communication schedules, hinting at the methods used, e.g., shortwave radio bursts, coded telegrams. The foreign intelligence agencies potentially involved were analyzed further based on the nature of the intelligence sought and the languages used. While Germany seemed a primary client or controller, the presence of Russian language elements and focus areas suggested either a secondary relationship, a different phase of the operation serving Soviet interests, or even a double-agent scenario where information was being sold or provided to multiple parties. This added a layer of complexity and potential betrayal within the operation itself. The ethical and political considerations of the discovery remained paramount. The FBI was operating under strict orders to maintain secrecy until a full assessment of the contents and their implications could be made. The potential for historical revisionism, damage to reputations, and international diplomatic fallout required extreme caution. The narrative being constructed from the dusty artifacts was one of sophisticated espionage and influence operations conducted on American soil during a time of global crisis, hidden away and forgotten until renovations literally peeled back the layers of time. The identity of the ghost who inhabited Room X, the architect of Project Nightingale, was the key to unlocking the full story, connecting the archive to a specific individual and their ultimate motives and allegiances. But decades of silence and meticulous planning had made that identity the most elusive secret of all. As months passed, the multidisciplinary team working on the Grand Madison archive made incremental but significant progress. The vast majority of the documents were processed, cleaned, scanned, transcribed, and indexed. The coded messages were largely decrypted, revealing a continuous stream of intelligence reports and operational instructions spanning several years. The financial records were cross-referenced with known market data and historical financial institutions, adding credibility to the transactions documented. The identity of the operative remained unconfirmed by a single definitive piece of evidence, but the cumulative weight of indirect clues began to point towards a highly probable candidate. Analysis of the handwriting, combined with painstaking research into individuals who had long-term residences at the Grand Madison or frequented the hotel's public spaces during the operational period of Project Nightingale, narrowed down the possibilities. One individual, a European national who had resided in Washington, D.C. for several years in the late 1930s under the guise of being a businessman or cultural attaché, fit the profile. Historical records indicated he had extensive international travel, connections to figures mentioned in the archive, and disappeared from the US shortly after America entered World War II, his fate remaining unclear in public records. While no direct match of his known handwriting to the archive documents existed, he primarily used typed correspondence publicly. The analysis of linguistic patterns in the operative's handwritten notes and translated messages showed strong similarities to this individual's known linguistic background and phrasing. The specific foreign brand of cigarette identified from the ashtray was also one known to be preferred in his country of origin during that era. This individual, while not a famous spy from history books, held a position that would have provided cover and access to relevant circles. The theory forming was that this person established the hidden room as a secure base, managed the network, and reported to handlers abroad. His sudden departure would explain why the room was sealed in haste, leaving documents behind with the apparent intention of retrieving them later, an intention presumably thwarted by changing global circumstances or his own fate. The network itself, Project Nightingale, was revealed as a highly effective, long-term influence operation, that successfully gathered sensitive intelligence and attempted to shape US perceptions and policies during a critical pre-war period. The intelligence provided covered areas directly relevant to the strategic interests of totalitarian regimes in Europe. Information on US economic vulnerabilities, industrial capacity, political divisions regarding interventionism, and public sentiment towards fascism and communism. The success of the operation underscored the vulnerability of the US to foreign influence at a time when its intelligence and counter-espionage capabilities were still developing. The implications of these findings were significant. While the specific actions influenced by Project Nightingale were difficult to prove definitively decades later, historical outcomes are complex and multi-causal, the intent and the capability were clearly documented. The archive provided irrefutable proof of a sophisticated foreign-directed network operating at the heart of the US Capitol with the goal of undermining potential US involvement in the war and gathering intelligence for adversarial powers. The sensitivity of the material meant that the FBI's findings were classified at a high level. The full details of the network, the identities of the individuals involved, both the likely operative and the US source's assets, many of whom had long established public legacies, and the extent of the intelligence gathered were deemed too sensitive for immediate or full public release. Releasing the information without careful consideration could lead to historical reassessments, damage reputations, some unfairly, if their involvement was coerced or minor, and potentially still have national security implications related to intelligence methods or historical relationships between certain families or institutions and foreign interests. A highly redacted report on the discovery of the archive might eventually be released, confirming the existence of a significant pre-war espionage operation run from a Washington hotel. But the granular details, the names, the specific intelligence, the methods, would likely remain classified for a considerable time. The objects found in the room, the furniture, the spy gear, the artifacts, were transferred to secure government storage, possibly to be declassified and exhibited decades from now, or perhaps to remain part of the Bureau's historical archives as a case study in Cold War, or rather pre-Cold War, espionage. The room itself, once its historical and evidentiary value was fully documented, was carefully reintegrated into the hotel's renovation plans, though perhaps with a plaque acknowledging its unique past, albeit without revealing the full, classified story of what was found within its sealed confines. The Grand Madison could resume its life as a luxury hotel, its walls now holding one more layer of history, a secret chapter uncovered not by dramatic pursuit, but by the quiet work of renovation and the patient analysis of forgotten dust and brittle paper. The Grand Madison Hotel eventually completed its renovations, reopening to the public with restored grandeur. The fourth floor, including the area where the sealed room once existed, now featured modern amenities seamlessly integrated with historical architecture. To the casual guest, there was no sign of the hidden space that had held its secrets for so long. The wall along the corridor was just another wall, painted and adorned with period artwork. The suites adjacent to where the room had been were spacious and elegant, their historical connection to a covert past known only to a select few. Inside the FBI, the analysis of the Project Nightingale archive continued in a more long-term historical context. The information gleaned was invaluable for understanding the history of foreign intelligence operations targeting the United States, the methods used during that era, and the specific vulnerabilities that existed. The debriefing and integration of the findings into historical intelligence records became part of the ongoing effort to learn from the past. The identity of the probable operative, while not officially confirmed by an undeniable piece of identification, became the working theory within the Bureau. historical investigators continued to look for corroborating evidence in other archives, both US and, where possible through international cooperation, foreign. The hope was that one day, a cross-reference in a declassified foreign intelligence file or a forgotten personal diary might definitively link the individual to the contents of the room and confirm their role as the architect of Project Nightingale. The fate of the operative remained unknown. Did they escape and continue operations elsewhere? Were they captured or killed during the war? The archive offered no clues beyond the abruptness of their departure. The individuals named in the archive, the members of the network, became subjects of extensive historical review within the intelligence community. For those long deceased, their historical roles were quietly re-evaluated. For any who might still be alive, though increasingly unlikely given the time frame, or whose descendants held positions of sensitivity, the information was handled with utmost discretion, adhering to strict protocols regarding classified historical information. The ethical questions surrounding the revelation of such long-buried secrets continued to be debated internally. The balance between historical truth and the potential for harm, even decades later, was delicate. For now, the decision stood. The full, granular story of Project Nightingale would remain classified, a hidden chapter within the government's own archives, mirroring the way the original archive was hidden within the hotel's walls. A carefully worded, highly redacted public statement might, at some point in the distant future, acknowledge the discovery of historical intelligence materials in a Washington D.C. hotel, vaguely referencing a pre-war espionage operation, but without details that could identify individuals or compromise methods. The physical artifacts from the room, the desk, the chair, the chests, the spy cameras, the ledgers, were carefully preserved. They were stored in secure, climate-controlled facilities, potentially destined for a future exhibit at the International Spy Museum or the National Archives, but only after further declassification reviews, which could take years, if not decades. When and if they are ever put on display, they will tell a story, but likely an incomplete one, the most sensitive names and details omitted for reasons of national security or historical privacy. The dusty, forgotten room in the Grand Madison Hotel, stumbled upon during a routine renovation, had yielded a historical treasure trove, not of gold or jewels, but of secrets and lies from a pivotal moment in history. It served as a potent reminder that history is not always neatly recorded in books and public records. Sometimes, its most intriguing chapters are hidden away, waiting patiently in the dark, silent spaces of the buildings we walk past every day. And sometimes, it takes nothing more dramatic than a renovation crew with a saw and a scanning device to bring those secrets into the light. The final status of the Grand Madison Archive project within the FBI transitioned from an active recovery and analysis operation to a long-term historical study and intelligence integration effort. The vast digital database created from the scanned documents became a resource for analysts studying historical espionage techniques, counterintelligence challenges of the early 20th century, and the historical context of foreign influence operations. Academic historians with appropriate security clearances might, in the future, be granted limited access to sanitized portions of the archive for research purposes, contributing to a more nuanced understanding of the period, albeit with significant gaps where classified information has been removed. The sheer volume of data, even after initial analysis, contained threads that could be followed for years, cross-referencing every name, every date, every location with other historical records, attempting to build a more complete picture of the network's reach and impact. The individual identified as the probable operative continued to be a subject of historical intelligence interest. Investigators sought to confirm his identity definitively and understand his full career. Was Project Nightingale his only assignment? Was he a high-ranking officer in a foreign intelligence service or a particularly skilled independent asset? His disappearance in the early 1940s remained a key point of mystery. Could his fate be linked to the sudden sealing of the room? Perhaps he was compromised, captured, or killed. Without further information, this remained speculation, adding another layer to the human story behind the archive. The locket photo was eventually subjected to more advanced facial reconstruction techniques, attempting to generate a clearer image of the woman's face, hoping for a match with historical photos of individuals associated with the likely operative or figures mentioned in the archive. This effort yielded some promising leads, pointing towards a woman who had also vanished around the same time, potentially a partner, a fellow agent, or someone else tied to the operation. But definitive proof remained elusive. The physical artifacts from the room were catalogued and stored in the FBI's historical property section. The miniature cameras, once carefully disassembled and studied by forensic engineers, revealed the technological state of covert photography during that era. The radio components hinted at communication methods beyond coded messages delivered by courier or telegraph. These objects served as tangible links to a hidden past, silent witnesses to the activities that took place within the sealed room. The legacy of the Grand Madison discovery within the Bureau was significant. It highlighted how historical buildings in sensitive locations could harbor long-forgotten secrets of national importance. It led to a review of procedures regarding historical renovations of properties with past government or diplomatic connections in Washington, D.C. and other major cities, prompting closer liaison between developers, historical societies, and federal agencies when anomalies are detected. The story of the sealed room in the Grand Madison, while largely unknown to the public, became a legendary case study within the FBI's historical and counterintelligence divisions. A reminder that the past is never truly buried, and sometimes the most profound discoveries are made not through active pursuit, but through patience, meticulous work, and a bit of serendipity in the most unexpected places. The dust of decades, settled over forgotten furniture and brittle paper, held a story waiting to be told, a story of influence, intelligence, and the hidden currents of history that flowed beneath the surface of public life in the nation's capital. And while much of that story remains confined to classified files, its impact resonates in the understanding of historical events and the ongoing efforts to protect national security.